Orson Aldridge slammed his palm on the kitchen table so hard the oil lamp rattled. "You will stay in the back room," he said, and his voice had that flat, final quality that meant arguing would cost her something. "You will not sit at that table. You will not speak unless spoken to. And for the love of everything decent, you will wear something that doesn't make you look like you're trying to compete with your sisters." Tamsin stood with a dish towel still in her hands and said nothing. "Do you hear me?" Orson stepped closer. "The wealthiest man in this entire valley is coming to my table tonight. Lenora and Blythe have worked very hard to make themselves presentable. The last thing I need is you standing there looking the way you look and ruining everything I've spent 2 years building." Tamsin folded the dish towel slowly, carefully. "Yes, sir," she said. She understood him perfectly. If this story already has you gripping the edge of your seat, this is only the beginning. Subscribe to our channel right now so you never miss what comes next. Hit that like button, drop a comment telling us what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story has traveled. Now let's get into it. The barn dance had been going on for almost 2 hours before the horse lost its mind. It was a gray gelding, 17 hands at least, tethered to the far post of the Morrow barn, while fiddle music scraped through the warm August air and couples moved in loose circles on the packed dirt floor. Someone had tied the rope too short and looped it wrong, and when a dog darted between the animal's legs and barked twice, the gelding threw its head back hard and pulled. The knot pulled tighter instead of loosening. The horse panicked. 300 pounds of muscle started slamming sideways into the post, and the rope was cutting into the poor creature's neck at a bad angle. 4 men stood near the entrance watching it happen. One of them said, "Somebody ought to do something about that." Another said the owner should handle his own animal. A third said the rope was probably too tangled to work loose anyway. None of them moved. Tamsin Alderidge was carrying a tray of cups from the refreshment table toward the far corner of the barn when she heard the sound that particular pitched scream a horse makes when it's more frightened than hurt, and she set the tray down on the nearest surface without looking to see what it landed on. She crossed the barn in 16 steps, ducked under the swinging head, got her left hand flat against the horse's neck the way her mother had taught her, and spoke directly into the animal's ear in a low, steady stream of nothing words. Not calming phrases, not commands, just sound, continuous, even sound that gave the horse something to follow. The gelding stopped thrashing. Tamsin worked the rope with her right hand, while her left kept up that contact. The knot had gone solid from the pulling, the way bad knots always do under pressure, and she reached into the pocket of her faded brown skirt and pulled out the short-handled knife she carried for fence work. 2 cuts, the rope fell away. The horse shook its whole body like a dog coming out of water and then stood still, sides heaving, and let Tamsin run her hand down its nose. She was looking at the horse's neck to check for rope burn when she became aware that someone was holding a lantern up close enough to give her light to see by. She hadn't asked for it, hadn't noticed anyone approach. She looked up. A man she didn't know stood about 4 feet away, holding the lantern at the right height and angle without being told. He was roughly built, somewhere past 30, with dark hair and a face that looked like it had taken weather seriously for many years. He wasn't watching the horse. He was watching her hands. "Left side's clean," he said. "Right side, just below the jaw. Small abrasion, nothing that'll scar." He'd looked at the injury before she had. "Thank you," Tamsin said, and because she didn't know him and she didn't particularly want to have a conversation, she turned back to the gelding and checked the spot he'd identified. He was right. She touched it gently, and the horse flinched once, then let her examine it. "You've done that before," the man said. It wasn't a question. "Cattle work," Tamsin said. "Same principle." He nodded and lowered the lantern slightly. Around them, the dance had resumed, the fiddle scraping back into a reel, and the 4 men who had stood watching were now talking about something else entirely. The man with the lantern didn't offer his name, and she didn't offer hers, and after a moment he walked away, back toward the edge of the lamplight where the strangers at these events always stood. Tamsin watched him go for exactly 2 seconds, then went back to the refreshment table. She forgot about him by the time she was home. 4 days later, at the supper table, her father, Orson Alderidge, told the family that Ronan Whitlock was coming to dinner. Lenora, 22 years old and very aware of how her dark hair looked in candlelight, sat up straighter. The Whitlock from the Hargrove purchase? The one who bought the Carver tract and the 2 northern sections? Orson said yes, that Whitlock. Blythe, who was 19 and still in the habit of reaching for her mother's hand when she was excited, reached for her mother's hand. They say he has more money than anyone in the county. More than anyone in 4 counties, Orson corrected her, and there was something in his voice that Tamsin recognized. It was the sound of a man who had spent a long time calculating and now believed the answer was finally coming into reach. Dorothea, their stepmother, said immediately, "We'll need to do something about the parlor curtains. And Lenora, we should press your blue dress. The blue one with the collar." "What about my green?" Blythe said. "The green is very good," Dorothea agreed. Tamsin reached across the table for the salt and said nothing. She was 26, which put her 4 years past what Dorothea considered the useful window for this kind of maneuvering. She had also learned, over 9 years of living in this house, that staying invisible at moments like this was simply the path of least resistance. She ate. She listened. She kept her face neutral. Under the table, she was calculating which section of the north fence needed the most immediate repair, and whether they had enough wire left in the shed. Tamsin. Her father said her name like it was a task item. "You'll serve at dinner. Kitchen, not the table. If the good china needs washing, do it tomorrow morning so it's ready." "Yes, sir, and wear something decent, not those work clothes." "Yes, sir." Dorothea was looking at her with that expression not unkind exactly, more like practical. "The gray dress," she said. "The one with the buttons at the collar. That one is appropriate for serving." Tamsin looked at her stepmother. "The gray dress," she repeated. "Yes, it's modest. It won't draw attention." Tamsin nodded once and went back to eating. The gray dress Dorothea meant was a practical piece of clothing in every unflattering way possible. The fabric had gone thin at the elbows. The hem had been let down twice and then taken up again when the fabric got ragged, so it now sat at an awkward mid-calf length that suited nobody. The color had faded unevenly from whatever it had originally been to a dingy, indeterminate gray that absorbed light rather than reflecting it. It had been Dorothea's dress originally, purchased when she was heavier, and then passed to Tamsin because it fit no one else, and it was practical to have something to wear for rough indoor work. In other words, it was the most effectively ugly garment Tamsin owned. She decided to wear it, not because Dorothea told her to. She'd stopped doing things simply because Dorothea told her to around the time she turned 19. She decided to wear it because if Ronan Whitlock was coming to this house to look at women the way men like that came to look at women, she wanted absolutely nothing to do with the process. She'd seen what happened to women who got selected by wealthy men because of their faces. She'd watched her mother get selected that way. She knew what it cost. The morning of the dinner, Tamsin was out at the north section before 5, checking water levels at the spring-fed tank that fed the upper cattle run. The spring had been dropping since June. Not dramatically, not the kind of drop that made you panic, but steadily, consistently, the way problems that eventually become catastrophes always start. An inch a week, maybe less. You could tell yourself it was nothing until it was everything. She walked the fence line after that, cataloged 3 posts that needed replacing, found evidence of a small grass fire that had burned itself out near the eastern ridge, a patch of scorched ground about the size of a wagon, probably lightning from last week's storm. She stood looking at it for a while. The grass was dry this year, drier than she could remember. The creek in the low section had been running shallow since May, and the northern winds had shifted in a way that bothered her, coming from the wrong direction, at the wrong time of year, dry and fast, the kind of wind that found sparks. She knew this land the way she knew her own hands. She'd grown up on it, worked it since she was old enough to follow her mother's instructions. When her mother died 12 years ago, the knowledge didn't disappear. It just transferred into Tamsin. She was back at the house by noon, had the china washed and dried and stacked by 2, had the kitchen prep done by 4, and was changed into the gray dress by 5:30. She had pulled her hair back tightly, as plainly as she could manage, and looked at herself in the small mirror above the washstand. What looked back at her was not what she usually saw, because she usually avoided looking. But she made herself look now, because she wanted to be sure the gray dress was doing its job. It was. She looked exhausted and faded and entirely unremarkable. Good. She went to check on the soup. Ronan Whitlock arrived at 6. Tamsin was in the kitchen when she heard the horses and the sound of Dorothea's voice going up 2 registers the way it did when she was performing Welcome. She kept her attention on the pot. She could hear Orson's voice too, the particular tone he used with people he was trying to impress slower than usual, more deliberate, each word landing like it had been considered. She heard Lenora laugh, which was a practiced sound, slightly musical. She heard Blythe say something and then make a small noise of apology. She did not hear the guest's voice clearly enough to distinguish it. Then Dorothea came into the kitchen doorway and said, "Tamsin, we're ready to begin." First course. Tamsin lifted the breadbasket and the soup tureen together and carried them through the door into the dining room. The man sitting at the far side of her father's table was the man from the barn. She stopped for exactly 1 second, maybe less. She made herself keep walking, set the breadbasket nut down in the center of the table, moved to serve the soup from the correct side the way Dorothea had drilled into her years ago. He was watching her, not the way men usually watched her, which was a particular kind of attention she'd learned to root around, the way you root around a muddy patch of ground. He was watching her the way he'd watched her hands in the barn. Like he was trying to understand something. She kept her eyes on the soup. "Mr. Whitlock," Orson was saying, gesturing, "my eldest daughter, Tamsin. She assists with the household." Ronan Whitlock looked at Orson. Then back at Tamsin. "We've met," he said. The dining room went quiet in a specific way. Dorothea's silence had a question in it. Lenora's had something sharper. "The Morrow barn dance," Tamsin said, because there was no point pretending otherwise, and she set the last soup bowl down and moved back toward the kitchen door. 4 days ago, the gray horse. "The gelding," Ronan said. "Yes. Enjoy your soup," Tamsin said, and went back to the kitchen. She stood at the counter for a moment, with both palms flat on the wood surface, breathing. She hadn't done anything wrong. She'd done nothing at all. But there was a small, uncomfortable feeling running through her chest that she recognized as the sensation of being seen by someone she hadn't prepared herself for, and she needed a moment to let it settle back down. It settled. She went back to work. Through the meal, she moved in and out of the dining room with the careful efficiency she'd perfected over years of these dinners. She heard enough. Orson talked about the ranch carefully, in a way that minimized its actual problems. Dorothea talked about the girls' accomplishments. Lenora mentioned that she'd completed a very satisfying piece of embroidery recently and was learning to play the parlor organ. Blythe said she made very good preserves and blushed when Ronan said that was a useful skill. Ronan was polite. Not warm, exactly. He answered questions and asked a few of his own, and none of them were the questions Orson was hoping for. Tamsin was coming through with the coffee when she heard Ronan say, "Mr. Alderidge, who manages the cattle operation? You mentioned you run about 80 head. "I oversee it," Orson said. "Day to day I have a man, Dupree, who handles the physical work." "Is that who decides which pastures rotate and when?" Short pause. "We discuss it." Tamsin set the coffee pot on the sideboard and began filling cups from the far end. She did not look up. "I rode the northern section last week," Ronan said. "Before I came to call, the water tank on the upper run is dropping. I'd estimate you've got 6 weeks of full capacity left, maybe 8 if the rains come back." "We're monitoring it," Orson said. Tamsin poured his coffee and moved on. "Who's monitoring it?" Ronan asked. Another pause, longer this time. "Tamsin manages the water schedule," Dorothea said, which surprised Tamsin enough that she almost overflowed Lenora's cup. She recovered and kept pouring. Ronan turned and looked at Tamsin directly. "You checked the spring levels?" She met his eyes for the first time since she'd walked into the room. "Every morning," she said, and she glanced at her father. Orson's face was the careful, composed expression of a man who wanted her to say something pleasant and brief. She looked back at Ronan, and it's been dropping about an inch a week since the middle of June. If the pattern holds, we'll be in trouble by late September whether the rains come back or not. The grass fire I found this morning on the eastern ridge is a secondary concern, but given how dry the season's been and the wind patterns I've been watching since July, I'd call it the more urgent one." The table was quiet. Lenora was looking at her soup bowl. Orson's jaw had gone slightly tight. Ronan Whitlock said, "Grass fire. Burned itself out. Probably lightning from the storm last week. But it went through a section that should have been green this time of year and wasn't, which tells you what this moisture situation actually looks like versus what the calendar says it should be." "Where exactly?" "Eastern Ridge, roughly a quarter-mile north of the old Carver fence line." "You'd have come through that section on the way up from the main road." "I did," he said. "I saw the scorching, but I thought it was an old burn." "It's not," she said. He looked at her for a moment. She could feel Dorothea's tension from across the table, the particular silence of a woman trying very hard to redirect a conversation that had gone somewhere she didn't plan for. "Thank you," Ronan said. "That's useful." Tamsin nodded and went back to the kitchen. She was washing the first set of dishes when she heard, faintly through the door, Dorothea beginning to talk about how Lenora had very fine taste in domestic arrangements. She pressed her lips together and kept washing. He stayed for just over 2 hours. She heard the front door close and the horses leave, and she was drying the last of the good china when Orson came into the kitchen. He didn't say anything for a moment. He stood in the doorway and looked at her. "You didn't need to do that," he finally said. Tamsin set the plate carefully on the stack. "Tell him about the fire? Tell him anything at all." That was Dorothea's moment. Lenora's moment. "You turned the whole conversation sideways," he asked. Men like that ask questions out of politeness. They don't expect answers. Tamsin turned to look at her father. He was a tall man, still lean, with a face that had been handsome once and still carried its structure well. He looked, as he often did when he spoke to her, like a man talking to someone he was slightly irritated to have to deal with. He expected an answer, she said. "He knew the spring levels were dropping before he asked me. He was checking to see if anyone here actually knew what they were dealing with." Orson's expression shifted. "Just slightly. You don't know what he was checking?" "No," Tamsin agreed. "I don't. But I know grass fire, and I know what it means when the Eastern Ridge burns when it should be green. And if Ronan Whitlock is going to be managing land adjacent to ours through a dry season, it seemed like a good idea to make sure he understood the situation." Orson stared at her. Then he turned and walked out of the kitchen without another word. Tamsin went back to the dishes. She told herself it was done. The dinner was over. She'd been useful. She'd been appropriate. And now it would go back to normal Orson managing his campaign to sell one of the girls to the Valley's most eligible bachelor, Dorothea managing Orson, and Tamsin managing everything that actually needed managing, while nobody particularly noticed. She believed this for exactly 11 days. On the 12th day, a rider came to the house with a note in a sealed envelope addressed to Tamsin Alderidge, requesting the loan of a knowledgeable guide for a survey of the southern and western grazing sections. Specifically, the note said, "Someone familiar with the water sources and seasonal patterns of Red Willow Basin." Orson read it twice. Then he called Tamsin into the front room and handed it to her without speaking. She read it. "He wants you to ride with him," Orson said. "His man can't make it, apparently, and he'd rather have someone who knows the land than take a chance on a stranger." He paused. "He asked for you by name." Tamsin folded the note and set it on the table. "When? Day after tomorrow. Morning. I can do that." "Tamsin." Orson's voice had changed. "Careful now. He is an important man. A very important man. And what that man thinks of this family is significant." "I understand that. Do you?" It wasn't quite a question. "Because the impression I want him to have of this family is... Pa." She said it quietly, but she said it. "I'll be his guide. I'll show him the water sources and the grazing sections, and I'll tell him what he needs to know about the land. That's what he asked for. That's what I'll do." Orson looked at her for a long moment. Something moved across his face. She'd never been entirely sure what it was: frustration, or something older and more complicated that he'd never found the words for. "Fine," he said. She rode out with Ronan Whitlock 2 mornings later, on a day that smelled like hot grass and distant weather. He was already waiting at the property line when she arrived, which meant he'd gotten there early, which meant she noted, without particular conclusion, that he'd come prepared to wait, rather than to be waited for. He had a good horse. A bay with clean lines and a calm eye, the kind of horse that didn't waste energy. She approved of it without saying so. "Morning," he said. Morning, she said. We'll start at the lower spring and work north. The western sections look better than they are right now, which is a thing you need to know before you make any decisions based on what you see today. He looked at her. Something in his face might have been amusement. All right. The grass greens up in the lower sections when there's surface moisture, even when the deep water table is down. Looks healthy. Isn't. Last 2 years, ranchers have grazed heavy on those sections in summer because they look good, and then hit hard fall because there was nothing left. You need to read the creek depth, not the grass color, to know where you actually stand. That's a good way to get it wrong, he said. It's the most common way, she agreed, and she turned her horse and started toward the lower spring. They rode. She talked when she had something to say and didn't when she didn't, which she was aware was not the usual way women accompanied wealthy men on anything. She showed him the spring levels, the creek readings, the sections where the soil was beginning to compact from overuse, the sections that had been rested long enough to actually recover. She showed him where the northern wind came through a gap in the ridge and what it did to the grass in that corridor. She showed him the 2 places where a fire, if it caught in the right-wrong conditions, could sweep down the valley at a speed that most people didn't understand until they'd watched it happen. He asked good questions, not polite questions, real ones. The kind that meant he'd been listening to what she'd actually said and had follow-up thoughts about it. She answered them. At midday, they stopped at the high point above the second spring. She'd brought food in her saddlebag the way she always did for long rides. He'd brought food, too. They sat on opposite sides of a flat rock and ate and looked out over the basin below. And the landscape spread out the way it always did, from this height, enormous and dry, and beautiful in a particular way. That things are beautiful when they're also slightly dangerous. You've been working this land since you were young, he said. It was an observation, not a question. Since I was 12, she said. When my mother got sick, she taught me before that. Your father didn't pass it to you formally. No, she didn't elaborate. But you know it better than he does. She looked at him. It's not something I'd say about my father. I'm not asking you to say it, Ronan said. I'm stating what I observed this morning. Tamsin looked back at the valley. He knows the land. He's known it a long time. We know different parts of it. He let that go. She appreciated that he let it go. The fire risk you mentioned at dinner, he said. The eastern ridge. How serious? Serious enough that I checked the wind every morning, she said. We had a bad burn in 81, 6 years ago. Came from the northeast, caught in the dry corridor, moved faster than anyone expected. Lost the Kemper family's barn and 40 head. Nearly took the ridge pasture, she paused. This year's drier than 81. Ronan was quiet for a moment. What would you do if you were managing the whole basin? Cut fire breaks on the northern ridge line before September. 2 of them, 1 on each side of the dry corridor. Store water wagon capacity on the eastern side, not because a water wagon can stop a big fire, but because you need water to control a backfire line if it comes to that. She looked at him. And I'd talk to every ranch in the basin and make sure they all know the protocol, because a fire in this valley doesn't care whose land it starts on. Ronan nodded slowly. He was looking at the valley the same way she was. I'll have the fire breaks cut, he said, starting next week. She looked at him. Your land or the full ridge? Full ridge. I'll work out the arrangements with the other landowners. She studied him for a moment. A man who'd just met her was about to spend money and time on precautions because she'd looked at the wind and the dry grass and the pattern of the season and told him what she saw. Most men wanted a second opinion before they'd do something like that. Most men wanted the opinion to come from another man. That's a good decision, she said. It's your decision, he said. I'm just the one with the resources to act on it. She didn't know what to say to that. She ate the rest of her biscuit and looked at the valley. They rode back in the late afternoon with the light going amber and the shadows stretching long across the grass. She was pointing out the northern water sources on the ridge when he asked, without preamble, why the gray dress? She looked at him. At dinner, he said, I saw you at the barn dance. That dress was not the dress of a woman who didn't think about what she was wearing. Tamsin said nothing for a moment. The horses moved at an easy walk. My stepmother selected it, she said finally, which was technically true. Your stepmother selected the ugliest dress in the house, he said, and you wore it without argument. That's not the same thing. She looked straight ahead at the trail. What is it then? I'm asking you. You're asking me about my dress. I'm asking why you were trying to disappear. The words landed in a particular way. Not uncomfortable, exactly. More like accurate, which was its own kind of discomfort. Because, she said carefully, there are men who come to my father's house looking for something specific, and I don't want to be part of what they find. He was quiet for long enough that she thought he wasn't going to answer. Then he said, What do they find? A face, she said. And they stopped looking after that. He didn't say anything. She glanced at him and found him looking at her, not with the expression she'd been expecting, not wounded pride or amusement, but something thoughtful. I'll say this once, he said, and I won't repeat it. I noticed the gray dress. I noticed the hair. I noticed the whole arrangement. And then you told me about the grass fire and the spring levels and what happens in the northern corridor when the wind comes from the wrong direction. And I stopped thinking about the dress. Tamsin looked at the trail. Good, she said. That's all. What else should I say? He thought about it. Nothing, probably, he said. Good is sufficient. She rode the last mile home in the low gold light and thought about a man who held a lantern at the right height without being asked, who ordered fire breaks cut based on her reading of the wind, who noticed when she was hiding herself and said so without making it a compliment. She untacked her horse and walked it to the water trough and stood there while it drank. The evening was cooling fast. The grass smell was sharp and dry. Above the eastern ridge, the sky had gone the particular deep orange that preceded clear nights' beautiful weather, and in a dry year, not entirely reassuring. She watched the ridge for a while. Then she went inside. Orson was in the front room when she came through. He looked up. How was it? Good, she said. He's going to cut fire breaks on the northern ridgeline before September. Orson stared. Whitlock is, and the water storage. He'll coordinate with the basin landowners. She moved toward the kitchen. He listens. Orson was still looking at her. She could feel it without turning. Tamsin, he said. She stopped. Don't, he started and stopped. Started again. Be careful. She turned and looked at her father. He looked for a moment, like a man who was trying to say something and didn't have the language for it. I'm always careful, Pa, she said. She went to start supper. 3 days later, Ronan sent another note. He wanted to discuss the water storage plan with her directly. Not Orson, her. She sat with the note in the kitchen for a long time before she folded it and set it in her pocket. The situation was becoming something. She isn't sure yet what kind of something it was. But she knew 2 things with reasonable certainty. First, that Ronan Whitlock was not the kind of man who came to a woman's father's house looking for a face to claim. And second, that this knowledge was both the most reassuring and the most unsettling thing she'd understood about anyone in a long time. She didn't let herself think beyond that. She wrote back and said yes. The water storage plan turned out to be 3 meetings, not 1. The first was at the Whitlock property, which Tamsin had never seen from the inside. She'd ridden past the main house a dozen times over the years, first when it was the old Hargrove Grove place and falling apart at the edges, and now it was something else entirely not showy, not the kind of house a man built to prove a point, but solid and well-maintained in a way that suggested someone was paying attention to it rather than just paying for it. She arrived at 8 in the morning on a gray horse she'd borrowed from the ranch stock because her own mare had thrown a shoe the previous afternoon, and she tied up at the rail and knocked on the front door like she did it every day. A man she didn't know answered, older with a careful face, who introduced himself as Cade and led her through to a back room that was set up as a working office rather than a parlor. Maps on the table. Real maps, surveyed and annotated, not the rough sketches most ranchers used. Ronan was already there with 2 other men she recognized. She recognized Hector Pruitt from the South Pasture property, and old Fen Dalloway, who ran the small spread at the basin's edge. They were looking at the maps when she came in, and they looked up. Pruitt said, Alderidge, in a tone that was not unfriendly but held a question in it. Pruitt, she said. Dalloway, she looked at the maps. You've got the drainage lines marked wrong on the northern section. The main channel runs about 40 yards further east than that shows. Dalloway squinted at the map. That's what the survey says. The survey's wrong. The survey was done in a wet year and the channel was running high. In a normal year, and especially in a dry one, it cuts east through the lower clay shelf. She looked at Ronan. It matters for the water storage. If you're positioning the holding tanks based on these drainage lines, you'll lose about a third of your capacity when the flow drops. Ronan looked at the map, then at her. Show me. She pulled the map toward her and traced the actual line with one finger, from memory, from years of watching the water move through that ground. The other two men watched. Pruitt was the kind of man who didn't like being corrected in front of other men. She could see that in the set of his shoulders, but he was also a practical man, and after a moment, he leaned in to look at where her finger had moved. That tracks, he said reluctantly. We lost a section of fence last wet season right about there. I always figured it was the channel cutting different than expected. It does every dry year, she said. It's been doing it since at least the 70s. My mother noted it. They spent 2 hours on the water storage plan. She corrected 2 more mapping errors and argued successfully for a secondary holding location on the ridge above the dry corridor, which Dalloway initially resisted because it meant more hauling. She laid out the math for him, plainly the extra hauling cost now versus the cost of losing 100 head in a fire that could have been controlled with an accessible water source. He didn't argue after that. Walking back to her horse afterward, she heard Pruitt say something to Dalloway behind her, too low to catch the words. She didn't turn. She untied the gray horse and mounted and rode back across the basin in the morning heat, and she told herself the feeling in her chest was just the satisfaction of a meeting that had accomplished something. She knew it was also something else. She just didn't feel like examining it yet. The second meeting was shorter. The third one happened at her father's property, which Ronan had requested specifically, and which Orson agreed to with a readiness that made Tamsin watch him carefully for the next 2 days. Her father was planning something. She could always tell by the way he moved through the house when he was a kind of coiled readiness, careful and patient, like a man waiting for the right moment to put something into motion. Dorothea had the house scoured top to bottom before the meeting. She had Lenora wear the blue dress with the collar. She had Blythe arrange flowers on the sideboard, real flowers, which meant she'd sent someone to the next town because there was nothing that fine growing in Red Willow Basin in August. When Tamsin pointed out that this was a working meeting about water storage, not a social call, Dorothea looked at her with the expression that meant the conversation was over. Ronan arrived with Cade and a surveyor she hadn't met before, and they spread the corrected maps on the kitchen table because it was the largest flat surface in the house, and they worked through the remaining logistics for an hour and a half. Lenora appeared in the doorway twice, Blythe once. Ronan acknowledged them both politely and went back to the maps. At the end of the meeting, when the surveyor and Cade were rolling the maps back up, Orson said with carefully practiced casualness, "Mr. Whitlock, we'd be honored if you stayed for supper." Ronan said, "Thank you. I appreciate the offer." He was buttoning his jacket. "I have another obligation this evening, but I'd like to come back later this week if that's agreeable. I have some questions about the cattle rotation that I'd prefer to discuss with Tamsin directly." The silence that followed was the kind that has texture. Orson said, "Of course." After Ronan left, Orson came into the kitchen where Tamsin was putting the cups away and stood in the center of the room and said nothing for a long moment. "Pa," she said. "I'm thinking," he said. "About what?" "About how this is going," he said. And the way he said, it meant he wasn't talking about the water storage plan. Tamsin put the last cup on the shelf. "Nothing is going anywhere. He needs information about the land. I have it. He could get that information from Pruitt or Dalloway." "He could get bad information from Pruitt or Dalloway," she said. "He knows the difference." Orson turned and left the kitchen. She heard him climb the stairs, which meant the conversation was finished in the way he finished. Conversation's not resolved, just removed. Lenora found her in the yard that evening when the light was going down. Tamsin was patching a section of fence near the water trough, working in the dim, because it needed doing, and evening was when she could do it without losing time from other work. Lenora stood at the edge of the yard, with her blue dress still on, and her arms crossed and watched her for a while before she said anything. "He doesn't look at us," Lenora said. Tamsin kept working the wire. "Who?" You know who. He's polite to you both. Polite, Lenora repeated. The word came out flattened, like something that had been stepped on. Yes, he's very polite. She paused. He looks at you the way people look at things they're trying to figure out how to hold. Tamsin stopped working. She turned and looked at her half-sister. Lenora was a genuinely beautiful young woman, and she knew it, had always known it, and had been taught since childhood that beauty was the most reliable currency she had. Standing in the yard in the fading light, with her careful blue dress and her careful dark hair, she looked like a woman who was beginning to understand that there was a currency she didn't hold, and it frightened her. Lenora, Tamsin said. Don't, Lenora said. Don't be kind about it. I don't want kind. All right, just tell me what you said to him. At those meetings, what do you talk about that takes 2 hours? Water, Tamsin said. Lenora looked at her. Water. And drainage, fire risk, seasonal cattle rotation. The soil composition in the eastern sections and what it means for grazing capacity in a dry year. She picked up the wire tool again. It's not interesting unless you know the land. And you do. Yes. Lenora stood there for another moment. Then she said, I could learn it. Tamsin looked at her again, carefully. Lenora's voice had been something other than what she expected. Not the usual performance. Something underneath it, smaller and more honest. Yes, Tamsin said, and meant it. You could, if you wanted to. Would Pa let me? The question hung there. Tamsin thought about her father, about the years of Lenora and Blythe being dressed and presented while Tamsin worked, about the architecture of assumptions that had built this household from the ground up. I don't know, she said, which was the most honest thing she could offer. Lenora nodded once. She looked at the fence for a moment like she was memorizing it, for some reason Tamsin couldn't identify. Then she turned and went back to the house. Tamsin finished the fence in the dark. Ronan came back on a Thursday as promised, and this time Tamsin had prepared a rough working document, not a formal report, just a list of observations and numbers. The kind of thing she'd been keeping in her head for years, and had never written down because there was no one to write it down for. Cattle rotation schedule, water source capacities by season, dry corridor wind readings as best she could estimate them. The 2 locations she'd identified over the years where a fire was most likely to start given the terrain and the prevailing conditions. She handed it to him at the kitchen table. He read it without speaking for several minutes. You've been tracking the wind patterns, he said. Since I was about 15, she said, when the 81 fire came through. I wanted to understand why it moved the way it did. And you wrote this from memory. I had it in my head. Seemed like a good time to put it on paper. He set the document down and looked at her. This is better information than anything the county land office has on this basin. The county land office sends men out in spring, she said. Spring's not when you learn this land. You learn it in August. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, I'd like to present this at the basin meeting next month. The one Pruitt's been trying to organize for the past year. All the ranchers together. He looked at her. I'd like you to present it. Tamsin said, why? Because it's your work. You could present it. It'd carry more weight coming from you. It should carry weight because the information is sound, he said. Not because of who's holding it. She looked at him across the table. He looked back. He had a quality she'd rarely encountered, the ability to say something that seemed simple and mean it in a way that was not simple at all, and then wait without trying to fill the space he'd created. I'll think about it, she said. That's fair, he said. He stayed another 40 minutes, asking questions she answered, and asking follow-up questions she also answered. And when he left, she sat at the kitchen table, looking at the document she'd written, and felt something she recognized with some difficulty as the sensation of being taken seriously. It was unfamiliar enough that she had to sit with it for a while before she trusted it. Then Dorothea came in and said that people in town were talking. Tamsin looked up. About what? About you and Mr. Whitlock. About the meetings. Dorothea sat down across from her, which was a thing she rarely did. It meant the conversation was going to be extended and deliberate. Margie Pruitt said something to me at the dry goods store today. She said she heard from someone that Ronan Whitlock has been meeting with Orson Alderidge, his eldest girl, more often than is appropriate for a business arrangement. Tamsin said, he's meeting with me about the water storage plan and the fire risk assessment. I know that, and you know that. But people don't see the maps in the surveys. They see a young woman riding out with a wealthy bachelor twice a week and coming home in the afternoon. That's not... Tamsin stopped, breathed. That's not what's happening. I know what's happening, Dorothea said, but I also know what it looks like, and in this town those two things are equally real. She folded her hands on the table. She looked for a moment genuinely tired in a way she rarely let show. Tamsin, I am not your enemy. Tamsin looked at her. I have not always been fair to you, Dorothea said. I know that. Your father has not always been fair to you. I know that too, but what I'm telling you right now is not about fair. It's about the fact that if this continues and nothing comes of it, nothing formal, nothing with a clear shape, your position in this community becomes very difficult. My position, Tamsin said. You're 26. If people decide you've been pursuing a man who had no serious intentions, that follows you. He's not... She stopped again. I'm not pursuing anyone. He asks questions about the land and I answer them. Then perhaps, Dorothea said carefully, someone should ask him what his intentions are. Tamsin stood up. No, Tamsin, no. She kept her voice even, barely. Nobody is going to ask that man anything on my behalf. If something is happening between us, and I'm not saying it is, it will happen the way I decide it happens. Not because someone backed him into a corner to protect my reputation. She picked up the document from the table. I appreciate what you're trying to do. I do, but no. Dorothea looked at her for a long moment. You are very much like your mother, she said finally, and it was impossible to tell if it was a compliment. Tamsin went to the barn. The town's opinion of the situation had its own trajectory. She discovered over the following 2 weeks, and it moved the way town opinions always did, faster than the actual facts, and in a direction shaped by whoever was doing the most talking. At the general store, a woman named Cora Besh said loudly, to no one in particular when Tamsin was 3 feet away, that she supposed some women knew how to use what they had. At the Morrow barn, another dance, smaller, a midweek thing, she overheard 2 men she didn't know well discussing, in the general direction she was standing. Whether the Alderidge girl was actually as smart as Whitlock seemed to think, or whether there was another explanation for his interest. She bought her flour. She went to the dance because Orson insisted. She kept her face neutral and her back straight, and she did not respond to any of it. But she thought about it. Lying awake in the narrow bed in her room that had always felt temporary in a house where she'd never quite been a permanent resident. She thought about what it meant that the version of events people found most believable was the one where she was using her face to get something from a rich man. Because the alternative, that she had knowledge and skill that a thoughtful man found genuinely valuable, was harder to hold. It required people to look at her differently than they'd been looking for 26 years, and people didn't like doing that. It was easier to reach for the story they already knew. Ronan found out about it on a Wednesday. She didn't know how she hadn't said anything, and she didn't think any of the people directly involved would have gone to him. But he arrived at the Alderidge property on a Wednesday afternoon, which was not one of their scheduled meetings, and she was at the water trough checking the tank level when she heard him come through the gate. She straightened up. He had that look he sometimes got, not angry exactly, but with something settled and quiet underneath that was more serious than anger. I heard what Cora Besh said at the store, he said. Tamsin said, it's nothing. It's not nothing, it's talk. It happens. I can manage it. I know you can manage it, he said. That's not the point. He stopped about 10 feet from her and looked at her directly. I should have been more careful about how this looked. The meetings, the frequency. I was thinking about the work and not about what it was doing to your... He paused, choosing the word. Your standing. My standing is fine, she said. Then, because it wasn't entirely true, she said it'll be fine. I'd like to make it better than fine, he said. She looked at him. What does that mean? He looked back. For the first time in their acquaintance, he seemed uncertain, not the settled, quiet certainty she'd gotten used to, but something less resolved. Like a man who had worked out what he wanted to say and was now discovering that the words were harder than he'd expected. It means, he said slowly, that I would like to make my intentions clear. Not to the town. To you. He paused. I'm not meeting with you twice a week because I need information about the land. I need the information, but that's not why I keep coming back. Another pause. I think you already know that. Tamsin held the water level gauge in both hands. She was aware of the exact weight of it, the metal handle worn smooth in a particular spot where she'd gripped it the same way for years. "I know it," she said. "All right," he said. "I haven't decided what to do with it," she said. "That's fair. I'm not." She stopped. Started differently. "I've seen what happens when women in this valley get decided about. They become the decision. They stop being themselves, and they become what someone chose." She looked at him. "I won't be that, I know," he said. "You say that." "I mean it." He said it without defensiveness, which was part of why it landed the way it did. "I'm not asking you to become anything. I'm telling you what I'd like. What you do with that is yours." She stood there in the hot afternoon, with the gauge in her hands, and the cattle moving somewhere behind her, and the dry smell of August all around. And she thought about the gray dress and the lantern, at the right height, and a man who asked her where the water actually ran when the ground was dry. "I need time," she said. "I know that too," he said, and he left without pressing it, which was itself an answer of a kind. She didn't sleep well that night. Not because she was distressed, she'd been through distress, and this wasn't it. It was more like sitting with a door she hadn't expected to find, and not being ready yet to know what was on the other side. She was still sitting with it 5 days later, when Orson told the family at supper that Sterling Whitlock was coming to review the lease. The name landed at the table with a different weight than Ronan's had. Orson said it carefully, like a man setting down something fragile. Dorothea set her fork down. Lenora looked at Orson. Blythe looked at the table. "Sterling Whitlock," Tamsin said. "The cousin." "The estate manager," Orson corrected. "Same thing." Orson looked at her. "He manages Ronan's land holdings. All of them, including the Alderidge lease." He said it plainly, which was how her father said things that were difficult. Flat and clean, so there was no room to pretend you hadn't heard. "We're behind on 2 quarterly payments. And the improvement schedule, the north fence, the barn reinforcement, it hasn't been completed." "I know why it hasn't been completed," Tamsin said. "We didn't have the materials. We ordered them in May, and they still haven't come through from—" "I know," Orson said. "Sterling Whitlock may not care about the reason." The table went quiet. Tamsin looked at her father. He was a man who had built his life around maintaining appearances, and he was, she could see clearly now, frightened. Not the performance of concern, but the real version, underneath, the thing he usually kept behind the practiced exterior. "When is he coming?" she asked. "End of next week," Orson said. "Friday." "All right," she said. She picked up her fork again and finished her food, and inside she was moving through what she knew the lease terms, the payment shortfall, the improvement schedule, the documentation she'd been keeping on the land improvement work that had been done, even if the formal items were incomplete. There was more work in that documentation than any lease document could capture. 14 years of work. She went to her room that night and started pulling the relevant papers together. She had not spoken to Ronan since Wednesday. She thought about sending word to him. She thought about it for a while and then decided against it, because if she was going to deal with Sterling Whitlock, she was going to do it on the terms of what she knew and what she'd done, not on the terms of who she happened to be spending time with. Sterling arrived on a Friday morning in a very clean wagon with very clean horses and a very clean suit that told her immediately that he was the kind of man who understood power as presentation. He was younger than she'd expected, late 30s, perhaps, with a narrow face and precise movements and eyes that moved around the property the way an accountant's eyes move around a ledger, looking for discrepancies. Orson met him at the gate. Dorothea offered refreshments. Sterling declined politely and asked to see the property documents. Tamsin stood at the back of the front room and watched him work through the paperwork. He was thorough. She'd give him that. He caught the payment shortfall on the second page and noted it without expression, and the incomplete improvement items on the fourth page with a slight pause that told her he'd already known about them before he arrived. Someone had given him the numbers in advance. That was fine. She had numbers, too. He looked up after about 20 minutes. He looked at Orson. The lease has 2 outstanding quarterly payments and 3 of the 7 required improvements uncompleted. Under the terms of the agreement, this constitutes material breach. Orson said, "We've had supply delays, Mr. Alderidge," Sterling said, not unkindly, with the particular patience of a man who had heard many explanations and found them uniformly insufficient. The supply delays are noted. They don't change the terms. He set the papers down and folded his hands. I have 2 other parties who have expressed interest in this property at substantially higher lease rates. My obligation is to the estate. The room was very quiet. Tamsin said, "Your obligation to the estate includes its long-term viability, doesn't it?" Sterling looked at her. "I'm Tamsin Alderidge," she said. "I manage the land operations. I know who you are," Sterling said. "Then you know that this property's water management, grazing rotation, and fire risk protocol represent years of documented work that isn't captured in a lease document." She crossed the room and set her stack of papers on the table next to his. "What your documents tell you is acreage and payments. What they don't tell you is where the water actually runs in a dry year, or how the cattle need to move to keep the eastern sections from degrading, or why the 2 sections along the dry corridor are worth significantly less without the fire management work that's been done on them in the last 6 years. Sterling looked at the papers she'd set down, then at her. "What the new parties who are offering higher rates are going to do," she continued, "is graze heavy in the first year to maximize their return. They'll hit the short grass in the lower sections in summer because it looks good. By their second year, they'll have degraded the eastern clay shelf enough that it won't recover in less than 3 years. And they will have no knowledge, none, of how to manage the fire risk in the northern corridor." She paused. "Your cousin understands this. That's why he's been meeting with me for the past 6 weeks." Sterling's expression had not changed significantly. That was, she thought, a sign of a good accountant, the face that didn't telegraph the calculation happening behind it. "You're suggesting," he said carefully, "that the knowledge specific to this land is itself a form of value that should be weighed against the payment shortfall." "I'm not suggesting it," she said. "I'm stating it. The question is whether you understand land well enough to know I'm right." The silence that followed was the kind that had actual weight. Orson had gone very still across the room. She could feel him processing this in real time, the discomfort of watching his daughter say to a powerful man's representative what he himself should have said and hadn't, and, alongside it, something else that she identified, slowly, as the possibility that he was reassessing something. Sterling looked at the papers she'd set down. He picked up the top one, the water management records, and read through the first page. He turned to the second. He read that too. He set it down. "These are thorough. 14 years of documentation," she said. "Some of it's mine. The earliest entries are my mother's." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I'll need to take these back for review." "I'll make you copies," she said. "The originals stay." Something crossed his face. Not quite a smile. More like a man filing a piece of information in a different category than he'd initially assigned it. "Of course," he said. The meeting broke up 20 minutes later without a resolution, which was itself better than the alternative. Sterling took copies of her documentation and his own papers and departed in his clean wagon, and Tamsin stood on the porch watching the dust from the wheels settle back onto the road. Orson came and stood beside her. "You didn't tell me you were going to do that," he said. "No," she agreed. "You've been keeping those records for 14 years, and you never showed them to me." "You never asked," she said, and kept her voice even when she said it, because she meant it as a plain fact and not as an accusation, even though the line between those two things was, in this particular case, not very wide. Orson was quiet for a long time, beside her on the porch in the August heat, looking at the road where the dust was still settling. "She'd have been proud of you," he finally said. He said it toward the road, not toward her. She knew who he meant. Tamsin stood on the porch and let it land. She didn't answer. She didn't need to. After a moment, she went back inside to start on supper, and she moved through the kitchen with her mother's knife and her mother's cast iron pot and the knowledge her mother had given her, like a map of a country only the 2 of them had ever fully walked. And she kept her face toward the work and let herself feel, just for a minute, the weight of 14 years of being present in a house that had always treated her like she was temporary. She felt it, and then she set it down and got on with supper. 2 days later, a rider came from Ronan. Not a note this time. The rider said only that Ronan would appreciate it if she could come to the North Ridge the following morning. There was something he wanted to show her. She went. She found him at the top of the ridge, where the firebreak crew had been working since the previous week. They'd cut a solid line through the dry grass and brush, 10 feet wide, clean down to the mineral soil. A second line was roughed in about 100 yards to the east, not finished but started. He was standing at the edge looking north when she rode up. "It's good work," she said, looking at the break. "Your specifications," he said. "Your crew." He turned and looked at her. He had that quality again settled, waiting, not filling the space unnecessarily. The morning was cool still, the ridge catching a wind from the north that smelled like dry grass and the first distant suggestion of a change in the season. "Sterling sent me a message," Ronan said. She looked at him. He said he met a woman at the Alderidge property who presented the most comprehensive land management documentation he'd seen in 15 years of estate work. He paused. He said, and I quote, that he found the conversation significantly more challenging than he'd expected. "That's a diplomatic way to say it," Tamsin said. "Sterling is a diplomatic man." He looked at her steadily. "He's also reconsidering his recommendation." She absorbed this. Below them, the basin spread out in the morning light, dry and golden and enormous, every section of it familiar to her, in the specific way that a place becomes familiar when you've walked it in every season for 26 years. "He shouldn't reconsider it because of me," she said. "He should reconsider it because the numbers support it." "The numbers support it because of you," Ronan said. "Those aren't different things, Tamsin." She looked at the firebreak. Clean and solid, exactly where she'd said it needed to be. "There's something else," he said. She waited. "There's a town meeting next Thursday. Basin-wide. Pruitt finally got it organized." He paused. "I'd like you to present your water and fire risk work. Formally, with your name on it." She turned to look at him. "You asked me about this before. I'm asking again. Because now Sterling has seen the documentation, and he'll be at that meeting. And if it comes from me, it's a rich man's opinion. If it comes from you, it's evidence." The wind came through the gap in the ridge the way it always did at this time of morning, dry and direct, bending the remaining grass at the break's edge. She thought about Cora Besh at the dry goods store. She thought about the two men at the dance. She thought about Lenora in the yard with her careful blue dress, saying, "He doesn't look at us." And she thought about her mother's handwriting in the earliest pages of the water management records, small and precise and permanent. "All right," she said, "I'll present it." Ronan nodded. The wind kept moving through the gap, north to south, the way it always moved in August when the conditions were building toward something the land hadn't shown its full hand on yet. She noticed it. She always noticed it. She just didn't know yet what it was building toward. The Thursday meeting was held at the Morrow Barn, which was the largest gathering space in the basin, and smelled on this particular evening of sawdust and old hay and the nervous energy of 23 ranchers who had been arguing with each other for years and were now being asked to agree on something. Tamsin arrived early. She always arrived early to places where she expected to need to hold her ground, because arriving early meant she could see the room before the room saw her, could assess the layout and the faces, and know where the difficult parts were going to come from before anyone had spoken a word. She set her documentation on the table at the front, 3 copies, neatly bound with string, and she stood beside it and watched the barn fill up. Pruitt came in with 2 men from the south section. He saw her and nodded, which was more than he'd given her at that first meeting at the Whitlock property, and she counted that as incremental progress. Dalloway came in, leaning on his cane, and chose a seat near the wall. Other men she knew, and a few she didn't, filled the benches in gradually, and the noise level rose in the particular way of men who were uncomfortable and covering it with conversation. Ronan came in last. He took a position near the back wall, not the front, and when a man near the door offered him a seat at the center bench, the seat that communicated importance, the one people aimed wealthy men toward, he shook his head and stayed where he was. She noticed that. She'd been noticing, over these weeks, the specific ways he moved in rooms, and what she'd observed was that he consistently chose positions that did not put him above other people. Whether this was instinct or deliberate, she hadn't worked out yet, but either way it had an effect on the rooms he entered that most men with his kind of money did not produce. Sterling was there too, seated near the front with his clean jacket and his careful face, and he looked at her documentation on the table, and then at her, and gave a short, precise nod. Pruitt called the meeting to order, which was nominally his role as the man who'd organized it, and he ran through the agenda items in the order he'd announced water allocation first, then grazing coordination, then fire risk. He gave each item about 10 minutes of general discussion. The water allocation discussion produced 3 arguments that went in circles and resolved nothing. The grazing coordination produced 2 men talking over each other until Dalloway told them both to sit down. Then Pruitt said, "Fire risk. Tamsin Alderidge has been doing land assessment work in the basin for some years now. She's prepared a report." He said it without editorial, which she appreciated, and he sat down. She stood up. The room did not immediately quiet. A handful of conversations continued for a few seconds, the way conversations do when they haven't registered that they were supposed to stop. Then they stopped, one by one, as men looked up and registered who was standing at the front. She'd worn her work clothes, deliberately. Not the gray dress, not anything that was about impression-making. She'd worn the clothes as she wore when she walked the land, because that was what she was talking about, and she wanted the connection to be visible. "The Northern Dry Corridor," she said without preamble, "is a fire channel. It has been since, before any of us were running cattle in this basin. The terrain creates it. The ridge on the east compresses the airflow. The grass in the corridor loses moisture faster than anywhere else in the valley, and the access points for controlling a fire once it's moving are limited to 3 locations, 2 of which require prior preparation to be usable." She picked up the first document. "I've been tracking wind patterns, moisture levels, and fire behavior in this corridor since 1881. What I have here is 6 years of data. I'm going to show you what it says." She talked for 35 minutes. She had not rehearsed exactly. She didn't work well from rehearsal. She worked from knowing the material deeply enough that the shape of it was always available to her, and she moved through the data the way she moved through the land by feel, by the internal geography of it, with the confidence of someone who had walked every inch of it in every season. She showed the burn patterns from 81. She showed the wind readings and what they predicted. She showed the 2 firebreak locations that Ronan had already cut, and she showed the 3rd location that still needed work. And she explained why each one sat where it did, in terms of the terrain and the fire behavior she'd observed. She showed them what would happen if a fire started in the corridor under this year's conditions with no preparation. She showed them the alternative. When she stopped, the barn was quiet for about 4 seconds. Then Hector Pruitt said, "That 3rd firebreak location. That's on my land." "Yes," she said. "You're asking me to cut a break through the middle of my north pasture. I'm showing you where the fire would need to go if it started in the corridor, and you needed to stop it before it reached the lower sections. What you do with that information is your decision." Pruitt looked at the map she'd drawn. He was a stubborn man and a proud one, but he was not a stupid one. "How wide?" 12 feet minimum, she said. 15's better." He looked at it for another moment. "I'll cut it," he said. "Next week." The man next to him said, "I've got the section east of Pruitt's north pasture. Where does that leave me?" And then it was not 35 minutes of her talking, but an hour and 20 minutes of the whole room talking, with her maps on the table and her documentation passing from hand to hand. And she moved between the groups, answering questions and drawing additional diagrams on the back of someone's receipt paper. And at one point actually went outside with 3 men to point at the ridge in the last of the evening light, because the conversation needed the visual to make sense. Sterling watched all of this. She was aware of him watching. He didn't say much. Near the end of the meeting, he asked one question, a technical one, about the water storage positioning relative to the 3rd fire break, and she answered it, and he wrote something in the small notebook he'd been holding all evening. They broke up well after dark. Men she'd known for years shook her hand, which was a thing that had not happened before in her memory. Old Dalloway, on his way out, stopped beside her and said, "Your mother used to say the land told you things if you were quiet enough to listen." Seems like she was right. He kept moving before she could respond. She was rolling up her remaining maps when Ronan came to the table. Most people had gone. Sterling was talking to Pruitt near the door. "That was well done," Ronan said. "It needed doing," she said. "Tamsin." He said her name in a particular way, with a weight to it that made her look up. It was more than that. Half these men have been running cattle in this basin for 20 years, and they learned something tonight they didn't know before. He paused. You changed something tonight. She looked at him. The barn was nearly empty now, the lantern light going long and low, and in the quiet she could hear the wind moving through the gap in the eave boards at the top of the wall. North wind. Still coming from the north. I'm going to check the ridge in the morning, she said. I'll come. You don't need to. I know, he said. I want to. She tied the maps with string and picked them up, and they walked out into the dark together, not quite side by side, with the night air moving around them, and the stars very clear above the dry basin. And she thought about her mother's handwriting in the earliest pages of the water records, and old Dalloway's voice saying she was right, and she held these things carefully. The way you hold things that are too important to examine fully in the moment, and save them for later. She went home. She slept better than she had in weeks. She was wrong about the morning. The fire didn't wait for morning. It started at 4:17 in the afternoon, 3 days after the basin meeting, on a day that had turned strange by noon. The wind had shifted overnight, moving from northwest to northeast, and it was coming fast and dry in a way she recognized from her records. She'd been watching it since she woke up, the particular quality of that wind, the way it bent the grass in a direction it didn't usually bend. She was at the water tank at the north section at 2 in the afternoon when she saw it. Not the fire itself. The smoke. A gray-brown column rising from somewhere behind the northern ridge, wide at the base and narrowing at the top the way structural fire smoke did rather than campfire smoke, and it was moving south. Moving toward the dry corridor. She was on her horse in 30 seconds. She rode hard to the ridge overlook, the high point above the second spring where she and Ronan had eaten their noon meal weeks ago, and from there she could see it clearly. The fire had started somewhere northeast, past the ridge, probably on unclaimed land or the edge of Dalloway's eastern section. It had caught in the dry grass, and it was running south and southwest with the wind behind it, and it was not a small fire. The front was already wider than anything she'd seen since '81. Maybe wider, and it was moving at the speed that fire moves when it has dry fuel and 20 miles of open wind behind it. The corridor. She turned her horse and she rode. She went to the Whitlock property first because it was closest and because Ronan had men and horses and she needed both. Cade met her at the gate and she said, "Fire on the northeast ridge, moving south into the corridor. I need riders. I need the water wagons. And I need someone to get word to every ranch in the basin right now." Cade looked at her for half a second, registered her face and her voice and the smoke above the ridge, and turned and started shouting. She didn't wait for Ronan. She went back to the Alderidge property, told Dupree to get the cattle out of the eastern sections and start moving them toward the creek country in the west, and she found her father in the front yard, already looking at the smoke. "How bad?" he said. "Bad," she said. "Maybe the worst I've seen. Get the roof soaked. Everything main barn, house, outbuildings. Every barrel you have, every trough, everything that holds water, get it up on the roof. And then get out of the eastern sections. Tamsin. Pa, roof first now." She went back to the ridge. Ronan arrived 12 minutes after she did, which meant Cade had moved fast. He had 4 riders with him and a water wagon, and he pulled up beside her and looked at the fire line for about 3 seconds without speaking. "It's going to hit the corridor," he said. "It's already in the corridor. The first fire break is holding it on the east side, but the front's going to come around below it." She pointed. "There. You see where the grass changes color? That's the moisture line. Below that line, everything is dry enough to burn in under a minute." He looked. "The second break. We'll slow it. Won't stop it. Not with that wind. Then what we burn it out," she said. He turned to look at her. "Controlled backfire. We ignite the section between the second break and the lower road. Move it north to meet the main fire front. When the 2 fires hit each other, they'll collapse. There'll be nothing left to burn." She looked at him. "I need your men on the east side of the section, holding the line with the water wagon while we ignite. If it jumps east, we stop it there. If it stays in the section, we let it run and we watch the collapse." He looked at the fire. He looked at her. "That section," he said carefully, "is adjacent to the Pruett North pasture. I know. If the backfire doesn't hold—" "I know," she said again. "It'll hold. The wind is from the northeast. The backfire will run northwest to meet the front. The geometry works. He looked at her for one more second. "Where do you want me?" he said. She put him on the east line with 2 riders and the water wagon. She took the other 2 riders and rode south to the lower road, and she explained the burn plan in the time it took to cover the ground clear and fast, because there was no time for long explanations. And because the men were looking at her face and to the smoke and making their decision based on those 2 things in roughly equal measure. Pruitt arrived with his crew as she was positioning the East Line riders. He came up hard and fast, and his horse was lathered, and he pulled up alongside her and said, "What in hell are we doing?" "Burning out the section between the second break and the road," she said. "That's my land south of there. I know. If the main fire gets through the corridor, it'll take your land anyway. If we burn the section now, we have a chance of collapsing the front before it gets that far." Pruitt looked at the fire line. He was a stubborn man and a proud one, but, as she'd established at the meeting 3 days ago, not a stupid one. "My north pasture," he said. "The break I cut. East anchor for the backfire line," she said. "It's 12 feet of bare ground. If the fire hits it, and the wind holds northeast, it dies there." He stared at the fire for a long moment. She could see him calculating, the way a practical man calculates, not hoping for the best outcome, but locating the least bad option and deciding whether he could live with it. "All right," he said. "What do you need from me?" she told him. He listened without interrupting, which was not something she'd seen Pruitt do with anyone in the past 6 years. And when she finished, he turned his horse and started giving orders to his crew with a directness that meant he'd understood. She positioned her 2 riders at the southern ignition points, and she took the center herself. The torch was a simple thing, a length of wrapped cloth soaked in lamp oil, and she lit it from the matches she carried in her vest pocket and held it in her right hand and looked at the section of dry grass in front of her. It was a significant amount of trust, what she was about to do. Trust in the wind direction holding, trust in the geometry of fire behavior she'd calculated based on 6 years of pattern observation, trust in the riders on the east line with the water wagon, trust in Pruitt's cut brake holding the anchor. She set the grass alight. It caught immediately. The dry season had done its work thoroughly. The fire took the grass and moved north fast, faster than she'd expected, and for about 30 seconds she watched it, and her chest was very tight because the wind had shifted slightly. Not dramatically, but enough that the angle was different than her calculation, and she thought for one terrible moment that she'd miscalculated the geometry and the backfire was going to run wrong. Then the wind shifted back. The backfire straightened its line and ran north. She could hear the main fire now, a sound she'd heard once before. In 81, that was not quite a roar and not quite a rush, but something between them. A sound that had no precise description, because it was too large for precision. The sound of something that consumed rather than burned. She watched the 2 smoke columns and tracked their movement, and she waited. The rider on her left shouted something she couldn't hear over the wind and the fire. She held her position. Ronan's voice came from the east, shouting something. She held. The 2 fire fronts were visible now, the backfire running north as a line of orange light, the main fire coming south as a wall of smoke with fire underneath it, and the gap between them was closing. She watched the gap. She watched the wind. She watched the grass at the edge of the section. They hit. It was not dramatic, the way a collision of physical objects is dramatic. It was a compression, the 2 fronts coming together, over the same ground, the same fuel, and finally nothing left to sustain them. The sound rose for about 10 seconds and then dropped, and the smoke thickened and then began to settle, and the orange light that had been moving steadily south stuttered and went uneven and started to die. She watched it for 2 minutes. The fire front had collapsed. The eastern section behind Pruitt's north pasture was smoking and black. The second fire break was intact. The corridor grass was burned back, but the break had held the east side. Pruitt's pasture was untouched. She let out a breath she'd been holding since she first saw the smoke. Then someone shouted that the Kemper barn was burning. She wheeled her horse. The Kemper property was at the southeast edge of the corridor, just far enough from the main burn that she hadn't put it in her immediate calculations, and it had caught from an ember the way barns always caught. Not from the fire front itself, but from the floating sparks that the wind carried ahead of the main burn line. The barn roof was well involved by the time she got there, maybe 60% of it, and the cattle were in the near pasture, not the barn, which was the only good thing about the situation. She assessed it in the time it took her horse to cover the last 100 yards. The barn was a loss. She could see that clearly. The structure was old and dry, and the roof was going fast, and there was not enough water nearby to do anything but defend the adjacent structures. The house was 20 yards west. The equipment shed was 15 yards north. House and shed, she shouted to the riders who came in behind her. Forget the barn. Wet the house walls and the shed roof. Right now. Someone said, we can't just let the barn. It's gone, she said. Don't let the house go too. The riders moved. The water wagon that had come south from the corridor pulled up, and she directed it to the house first, the south wall which was nearest the barn. And she watched the men work, and she watched the barn burn, and she assessed the drift of the sparks and kept moving people to cover the right exposure points. It took 40 minutes. When it was over, the barn was a black framework, with the walls partly standing and the roof entirely gone, and the house was intact, and the equipment shed had scorched paint on the north face, but its structure was sound. Eldon Kemper, who was 63 and had built that barn himself 20 years ago, stood at the edge of his yard looking at it. His wife was standing next to him, with her hand on his arm. Neither of them said anything. Tamsin dismounted and walked to him. "Mr. Kemper," she said. She didn't know what else to say first. He looked at her. He had a particular expression that she associated with older ranchers who had lost things before and knew the shape of loss, not broken, not immediately, but hollowed out around the edges. "Cattle are all right," she said. "House and equipment shed are intact." "I know," he said. She stood there with him for a moment. "I'm sorry about the barn." He nodded slowly. "Would have been worse," he said, "if you hadn't done what you did up in the corridor. That fire was going to come through here either way." "Yes, barn can be rebuilt," he said. He was still looking at the structure. "I know that. It's just 20 years of things in there." He stopped. His wife said, "Eldon, I know," he said to her. Then to Tamsin, the Whitlock man. "He organized the breaks. He organized the resources," Tamsin said. "The placement came from my assessment." Kemper looked at her directly for the first time. He had weathered blue eyes, the kind that had looked at sky and grass for so many years they'd taken on some of the color of both. "You knew this was coming," he said. "That's what the meeting was about." "I thought it was possible," she said. "I didn't know." "But you prepared for it anyway." She didn't answer that. It didn't need an answer. He looked back at the barn. "We'll rebuild in the fall," he said, to no one in particular, "when it cools off." She stayed until she was sure the ember risk was managed, until the men had wet down from everything that needed wetting and the wind had dropped, and the remaining smoke was rising clean and thin rather than thick and moving. Then she rode the perimeter of the main burn zone, the corridor section, the area around the second break, the eastern edge of the Pruett pasture, and checked each point where the fire had been closest to jumping a boundary. The second break had held everywhere it needed to hold. Pruett's break, the one he'd cut 12 feet wide, the one he'd agreed to cut 3 days ago in the basin meeting, had held the eastern anchor exactly as she'd calculated. She sat on her horse at the top of the ridge in the last of the afternoon light and looked at the burned section below. Black and smoking, with the fire breaks as clear pale lines on either side of it, like the margins of a sentence. A few stunted trees at the edge of the corridor had burned, but their root systems were intact. She could see from the color of the soil around them that the fire had moved through too fast to do deep damage. It would grow back. She was aware of a significant tiredness coming into her body. Not the sharp tiredness of exertion, but the deeper kind that comes after sustained decision-making under pressure. The kind that means you've been running on something other than normal fuel, and now the normal fuel is reasserting itself. She heard a horse coming up behind her. She didn't turn. She knew the sound of that particular bay by now. Ronan pulled up beside her, and they both looked at the burn zone without speaking for a moment. "The Kemper barn," he said. "Yes." "Everything else held." "Yes." He was quiet. She could feel him looking at her profile rather than the landscape. "When you lit the backfire," he said, "the wind shifted. Briefly, you didn't move. Moving wouldn't have helped," she said. "The geometry was right. I'd have seen it if the wind held in the new direction long enough to matter. It didn't. How long is long enough to matter? About 45 seconds. He looked at the burn zone. How long did it hold the new direction? Maybe 20, she said. He absorbed this. So you were watching it and calculating in real time? Yes, while also directing the east line and the Pruitt anchor. Yes. He didn't say anything else for a moment. When he spoke again, his voice had a different quality, quieter, more personal, the way his voice got when he wasn't managing anything, just talking. I stood on that east line, he said, and I watched you set that fire, and I thought. He stopped. She looked at him. I thought a great number of things, he said, and something in the way he said, it suggested he was editing heavily. One of which was that I was watching someone do exactly what they were built to do. She looked back at the landscape. I almost miscalculated, she said. The wind. If it had held 20 more seconds in the wrong directions. But it didn't. It might have, Tamsin. She turned. He was looking at her directly, steadily, with the patience that was his most consistent quality. You saved this basin today, not in the way that means everything was perfect. In the way that means you knew more than everyone else, and you acted on what you knew when it mattered, and most of it worked. And the part that didn't, the Kemper barn, would have been 5 times worse without you. She felt the words land somewhere real. She didn't deflect them. She'd gotten better, these past weeks, at not deflecting things from him. The meeting helped, she said. If Pruitt hadn't cut that break 3 days ago. Pruitt cut it because you gave him a reason to, Ronan said. All of it connects. You know that, she knew it. She let herself know it for a moment, fully, without qualification. Then she straightened in the saddle and looked at the horizon. I need to go check the south sections before dark, she said. Make sure the ember drift didn't catch anything in the lower grass. I'll come, he said. They rode down off the ridge together, into the cooling air and the smoke smell and the last of the light, and the burned section was below them and beside them, and the basin was intact, not perfect, not unscathed, but intact, and she kept her eyes on the ground ahead because there was still work to do before she could stop and let the day fully catch up with her. She was 2/3 through the south section check when she found the spot. A small patch of grass, maybe 15 feet across, smoldering at the edge of the lower road. An ember had caught it, probably 2 hours ago, judging by the char pattern, and it had been too small or too isolated to notice in the larger chaos of the main event. It had been burning slowly in the damp roadside soil, not spreading dramatically, but if the evening wind picked up. She dismounted and stamped it out herself, carefully, methodically, working around the edges first the way her mother had taught her. Ronan's dismounted and helped without asking, using his boot heel on the eastern edge while she worked the west. It took 7 minutes to fully suppress it. She checked it twice. Pressed her palm to the soil to feel for residual heat. It was out. That's the last one, she said, more to herself than to him. She stood up. The evening was fully cooling now, and the smoke smell was settling into the still warm ground, and somewhere in the lower basin she could hear cattle moving, which meant Dupree had gotten them turned around and heading back. Ordinary sounds. The sounds of a day returning to itself after something extraordinary had passed through it. Sterling was there, she said, at the fire. I saw him arrive about an hour after it started. I know, Ronan said. He watched the whole thing. Yes. She looked at him. What does that mean for the lease? Ronan's expression was neutral, in a careful way that meant it was covering something. He'll want to talk tomorrow, he said. I'll tell you what I know after that. She accepted this. She trusted, she found, that he would tell her what he knew. That was a new feeling, not quite trust, but close enough to it that the distinction was mostly technical. Your suit jacket is ruined, she said. She hadn't registered it until now, but the back of it was black with smoke, and there was a long scorch mark down the left sleeve that had started as an ember and been rubbed rather than catching. He looked at the sleeve. Yes, that probably cost more than I make in 6 months. Probably, he agreed, without evident concern. She almost smiled at that. She felt it start. And then she controlled it because she was tired. And when she was very tired, she occasionally lost her grip on the careful container she kept her expressions in, and she didn't want to lose her grip in front of him. Not yet. Not until she'd decided some things. She mounted her horse. Come to the Alderidge property tomorrow morning, she said. Before you talk to Sterling. I want to know what position I'm walking into before it happens. He looked up at her. All right. She turned the horse toward home. She was halfway there when she heard him call her name. She stopped. He'd ridden up to where she'd paused, and he pulled up beside her, and he looked at her in the last thin light of the evening, not the careful, managed look of a man arranging his expression, but the actual one underneath it. "Whatever Sterling recommends," he said, "I want you to know that it won't be the end of this conversation. What happens with the lease is a practical matter. What I want for you is separate from that." She looked at him for a long moment. "I know," she said. She rode home. Her father was on the porch when she came through the gate. The house roof was still damp from the soaking Dupree had ordered in the afternoon, and there were wet marks on the wall above the front windows. Orson was holding a coffee cup, and he looked at her as she dismounted, looked at the smoke dark on her face and clothes, the tiredness in how she carried herself, and something moved across his face that she couldn't immediately name. "How bad?" he said. "Kemper's barn," she said. "Everything else held." Orson nodded slowly. He looked at his coffee. "Pruitt's men were here about an hour ago. They said you ran the backfire operation." "Yes." They said he stopped. "Started differently. Hector Pruitt sent one of his riders to tell me personally that his north pasture held because of the break his crew cut 3 days ago, and that the break got cut because of the basin meeting." He paused again. "And that the basin meeting happened because of you." Tamsin stood at the foot of the porch steps. "He wanted me to know that," Orson said. "Pruitt. He sent a man specifically to tell me." She looked at her father on the porch with his coffee cup and his careful face and 26 years of history between them that had too many layers to sort through tonight, when she was this tired and this full of the day that had just passed. "I need to wash up," she said. "Tamsin." He said it the way he almost never said it, without the flat, practical tone, without the management. Just her name. "You did something today that I couldn't have done, that I didn't know needed doing until you'd already done it." She looked at him. He looked back. He didn't say anything else. He didn't have the words for what he meant, she thought, or if he had them, he couldn't find them quickly enough. But the look was real, and she understood what it was trying to carry, and she let it land, even if she didn't know yet what she was going to do with it. "I'm going to wash up," she said again, "and then I'd like supper, if there is any." Dorothea kept a plate, he said. She went inside. She sat at the kitchen table after she'd washed and eaten, and the house had gone quiet around her, and she sat with the day. The smoke and the fire and the sound of the two fronts colliding. Kemper looking at his barn. Pruitt saying all right. Ronan on the east line asking, "Where do you want me?" She sat with all of it. Outside, the wind had gone quiet. The night was clear and still, and the stars above the basin were very bright, the way they get in late summer when the air is dry and the smoke has settled and the darkness is genuinely dark. She thought about a door she hadn't been ready to open. She thought about it for a while. She wasn't sure she was ready yet. But she was beginning to understand, sitting in the kitchen in the quiet, after the longest day she'd had in years, that ready and willing were not quite the same thing, and that sometimes you moved toward something, not because you'd resolved all your uncertainty about it, but because the alternative staying still had its own costs, and you'd begun to see them clearly. She blew out the kitchen lamp and went to bed. She was asleep before she'd finished deciding whether she was ready. She woke before dawn with the smoke smell still in her hair. She lay there for a moment in the dark, listening to the house around her, the particular silence of a structure that had been under stress the previous day, and was now settling back into itself. The way timber shifts and breathes when the temperature changes. She could hear Orson moving in the kitchen below, which meant he'd woken early too, and she could smell coffee, which meant he'd been up long enough to make it. She dressed and went downstairs. He was at the kitchen table with his cup, and the lamp turned low, and he looked up when she came in and didn't say anything, which was a form of acknowledgement she'd learned over the years to read accurately. He was not a man who communicated easily in the early morning. She poured herself coffee and sat across from him, and they both looked at the lamp for a while. "Sterling is coming this morning," she said. "I know. Ronan sent word last night." He wrapped both hands around his cup. "What do you think he'll say?" "I don't know yet. I know what the grounds for the conversation are. I know what the documentation says." She paused. "I know what happened yesterday. I don't know how he weighs it." Orson nodded. He was doing that thing he did when he was thinking carefully, Frittam turning his cup a quarter turn, stopping, turning it back. She'd watched him do it her whole life without ever mentioning it. If he terminates the lease, Orson said, let's not plan for that yet. I need to know if we're planning for it. She looked at him. If he terminates the lease, we have 30 days under the terms. We'd need to either find a new arrangement with a different property or negotiate directly with Ronan outside the formal lease structure. She'd already thought it through. She'd been thinking it through since Sterling's first visit. There are options. They're not good options, but they exist. Orson was quiet for a moment. The girls, he said. She understood what he meant. Lenora was 22. Blythe was 19. If the family lost the property, their already limited options became more limited. I know, she said. I should have, he started and stopped. He turned his cup again. The improvements, the fence, the barn reinforcement. I let it slide because the money wasn't there, and I told myself it would come. It didn't come. No, she said. It didn't. You knew it was a problem. Yes. You didn't say anything. She looked at him directly. I said something twice. In the spring and again in June. She said it without heat, without the edge she could have put on it. Plain fact. You told me you'd handle it. He didn't argue with that. He looked at his coffee. I did, he said. I told you I'd handle it. The kitchen was quiet. Outside, the early light was coming gray through the east window, and she could hear the cattle in the near pasture beginning to move, and the particular sound of a bird she'd never learned the name of that always started before all the others. I'm going to handle today's meeting, she said. I'd like you there. But I'd like to do the talking. He looked at her. She held his eyes and waited. All right, he said. Ronan arrived at 7:30 and Sterling at 8, and this time there was no performance of welcome from Dorothea. She'd read the morning clearly enough to understand. It was not that kind of occasion. She offered coffee, and Sterling accepted, and then they all went to the front room, where Tamsin had laid the documentation on the table the previous night. Her own papers and Sterling's copies from his first visit side by side. Sterling looked at the arrangement when he sat down, and she could tell. He noted it, the deliberateness of it. The way it said, I know what you brought, and I've prepared what I have, and we're going to have this conversation on those terms. Ronan took the chair nearest the door and said nothing. He'd told her this morning, briefly, when he'd arrived before Sterling, that Sterling had been asking questions since yesterday afternoon, and that those questions had been specific and practical rather than dismissive. She'd taken that as a reasonable sign. Sterling opened his notebook. He looked at Tamsin. I want to begin with yesterday, he said. All right, she said. I was at the corridor from approximately 3 hours into the event until it was controlled. I observed the firebreak coordination, the backfire operation, and the Kemper barn suppression. He paused. I want to understand the decision-making sequence. Specifically the backfire. Walk me through it. She walked him through it. She was concise. She gave him the wind readings, the fire front width as she'd estimated it, the geometry of the backfire approach, and why the second break alone was insufficient, the timing of the ignition and what she'd been watching for during the burn. She told him about the wind shift and the 20 seconds, and what she'd been calculating during that period. He listened without interrupting. He took notes. He asked 2 clarifying questions, one about the water wagon positioning on the east line, and one about the specific trigger she'd been watching for, to know when to hold and when to abort. She answered both. When she finished, he looked at his notes for a moment. Then he said, You determined all of this in the field, under time pressure, without reference to anything other than what you'd observed and recorded previously. Yes. How long did you have from when you first saw the smoke to when you ignited the backfire? She calculated. About 2 hours and 20 minutes. And in that time you coordinated the evacuation, the roof protection, the livestock movement, the water wagon positioning, the East Line riders, the Pruitt anchor, and the ignition sequence. Along with other people, she said. Ronan ran the East Line. Pruitt ran his own crew. Kate organized the initial rider dispatch. But the decisions came from you. She looked at him steadily. Yes. Sterling closed his notebook. He looked at the documentation on the table between them. Then he picked up the water management records, the ones she'd put together 14 years of data in, the ones with her mother's handwriting in the earliest pages, and he set them down again. The lease, he said, the outstanding payments and the incomplete improvements. These are real deficiencies under the terms of the agreement. Yes, she said, I can't pretend they aren't, I know. However, he folded his hands on the table. My obligation to the estate is long-term viability. That's what you said to me at our first meeting, and you were correct. It's also the framework I use when I assess any property arrangement. He paused. What I observed yesterday is that the knowledge specific to this basin, the fire risk management, the water systems, the grazing rotation, is not something that can be transferred to a new tenant in a season. Or possibly in several seasons. The room was very quiet. Two of the ranchers I spoke with after the fire, Pruitt and Dalloway, told me independently that they would not have been prepared for yesterday without the basin meeting 3 days prior. Dalloway said, specifically, that without the fire break on Pruitt's north pasture, the fire would have come through his eastern section, and he would have lost his house. Sterling looked at Tamsin. His house has been on that land for 31 years. Orson, across the room, made a small sound that wasn't quite speech. The value of that preparation, Sterling said, is not abstract. It is measurable in what did not happen yesterday. And what did not happen yesterday is a direct function of the knowledge and judgment that lives in this woman at this table. He looked at Ronan briefly, then back at Tamsin. My recommendation has changed. I am not recommending termination of the Alderidge lease. Tamsin let out a slow breath. However, Sterling continued, the payment deficiency is real, and I need a resolution. A structured plan. 12 months to bring the outstanding amounts current, with the improvement schedule extended to 18 months with documented progress at 6-month intervals. That's manageable, she said. I need it in writing. A formal commitment from the leaseholder. He looked at Orson. You'll have it, Orson said. He said it with a firmness that suggested he understood what had just happened and what it had cost and what it had been saved by. Sterling nodded. He picked up his notebook and stood. He looked at Tamsin one more time, with that careful, measuring expression she'd become familiar with. You're wasted as a tenant's daughter, he said. It was not unkind. It was, she thought, as close to a compliment as his particular manner could produce. Then he picked up his hat and said good morning to Ronan and walked out. Orson sat in his chair and stared at the table for a long moment. Ronan stayed where he was near the door and looked at Tamsin. She looked back at him. There was something in his face that she recognized now, had been recognizing for weeks, since the barn dance, since the dinner, since the mornings on the ridge, but had kept at a careful distance while there was so much else to manage. She didn't keep it at a distance this morning. She let herself see it. What he felt, and that it was real, and that it had been real for a while. I'm going to check the south sections, she said. Because there was always something to do, and she needed a few minutes outside, with the sky and the air, and the smell of the burned grass and the cooling morning, before she could deal with the rest of what was in the room. I'll come, he said. Not yet, she said. She looked at her father. I'll be back in an hour, she went out. The south sections were quiet. The grass here hadn't been touched by the fire. The wind had carried everything north and east, away from the lower basin, and the cattle were grazing in the normal morning way, moving slowly, heads down. She walked the fence line on foot, leading her horse, and she checked the posts and the wire and the ground condition, and she thought. She thought about Sterling's phrase, wasted as a tenant's daughter. She thought about what it meant that a man who calculated everything in terms of estate value had looked at what she'd done and named it waste. She thought about Dalloway's house and the 31 years it had been standing, and what it would have cost Dalloway to lose it. And she thought about the Kemper barn and the 20 years of things in it that were gone now. And she thought about what the basin would look like in 10 years and 20 years, and whether the knowledge she carried would still be here in it, or whether it would be somewhere else, doing something else, or nowhere at all. She thought about her mother's handwriting in the water records. She turned the horse and went back. The house was different when she walked back in. The quality of the air in it was different. She'd noticed this before, how physical spaces hold the mood of what happened in them, for a while after it's over, the way a room stays warm after the people have left. The front room held the residue of Sterling's words and what they'd settled. Ronan was in the kitchen, which surprised her. He was standing at the counter drinking his second cup of coffee, and he'd moved the lamp to give himself more light, And he looked, in the ordinary light of the kitchen morning, like a man who had been waiting long enough to become comfortable with waiting. She sat down at the kitchen table. "Where's my father?" He went out to find Dupree. "Something about the west fence." She nodded. The west fence had 3 bad posts. She'd told Dupree about them the previous week. "Tamsin," Ronan said. "I know," she said. He looked at her. "You know what I'm going to say." "I know the shape of it," she said. "I've known the shape of it for a while." "Then I'm not ready to answer yet," she said. She said it clearly and without apology, because she'd learned that clarity, without apology, was the way she knew how to do things that mattered. "I know that's not what you want to hear." He set his cup down. "It's honest. I'll take honest. I need you to understand something first," she said. Before anything is decided or said, or she stopped, collected herself, tried again. "I've spent 26 years in this valley being looked at. Not seen. Looked at. And the 2 things are not the same, and most people do not understand the difference." She looked at him across the kitchen table. "You understand it. I believe that. But I need to make sure that what you want is not to have the most beautiful woman in the valley on your arm, because if that's what this is, it's going to end badly for both of us." He was quiet for a moment. "What do I want then?" he said. "In your assessment," she considered. "A partner," she said. "Someone who knows things you don't know and will say so directly. Someone who doesn't require managing or protecting or translating." She paused. "Someone who is inconvenient sometimes, who argues when she thinks you're wrong and is usually right about when she's right." His mouth moved in something that wasn't quite a smile. "That's an accurate assessment." "I know. Then you know what I want," he said. "And it's not the most beautiful woman in the valley." He looked at her steadily. "Although I will say, since we're being thorough, that the gray dress did not accomplish what you intended." She looked at him. No, not even slightly. She felt something move in her chest. Not the controlled thing she usually felt around him, the thing she kept in its careful container, but the actual version underneath it, which was larger and warmer and considerably less manageable. "I need time," she said. "I know," he said. "I've been patient." "You have. I can continue to be patient." "I know that too," she said. "That's part of the problem." He looked at her. "I'm a problem." "The patience is the problem," she said. "It makes you very difficult to argue yourself out of." He set his coffee cup down and looked at her across the kitchen table in the morning light, and she looked back at him. And the kitchen was quiet, and the morning was quiet, and outside she could hear the cattle in the near pasture, and somewhere further off the sound of Orson's voice talking to Dupree. "Take the time you need," he said. "I mean that. I'm not going anywhere." She nodded. He left shortly after, and the day opened up into the ordinary work of a morning after a significant event, the checking and rechecking, the small repairs, the conversations with Dupree about what had held and what needed attention. She moved through it all with the practiced efficiency she'd built over years of doing whatever needed doing, and she let the work steady her the way it always did. In the afternoon, Lenora found her in the barn. She was replacing a worn leather strap-on the draft horse's collar, which was painstaking work that required concentration, and she heard Lenora come in and sit down on the hay bale near the far post without speaking. She kept working. After a while, Lenora said, "Sterling is not recommending eviction." "No," Tamsin said. "Pa told us this morning." She paused. "He told us why." Tamsin kept working the strap. "He told us everything," Lenora said. "The meeting, the fire, the backfire, all of it." Another pause. He cried a little. When he was telling it. Just a little. I don't think he knew he was doing it. Tamsin stopped working. She held the strap in both hands and stared at the collar, and felt the weight of that image, her father who had spent 26 years being carefully composed in front of people, crying a little without knowing he was doing it. "Tamsin," Lenora said, "I owe you an apology." She turned to look at her half-sister. Lenora was sitting straight-backed on the hay bale with her hands folded in her lap. She was, as always, carefully put together, hair neat, dress pressed, but her face had something in it that Tamsin hadn't often seen there. Not the performance of one thing or another, the actual underneath. "For what?" Tamsin said. "For being angry at you about Whitlock," Lenora said. "For thinking for a while I thought you were doing something calculated. That you'd found out he was coming to dinner, and you arranged all of it, the barn dance, the whole thing." I thought she stopped. It wasn't fair. No, Tamsin agreed. I was scared, Lenora said. She said it plainly, which was more than Tamsin had expected from her. I'm 22. I don't know how to do anything except be pretty and make preserves and play the parlor organ badly. That's what I've been taught. And when I looked at you, she stopped again. When I looked at you, I saw someone who knew things. Real things. Things that mattered. And I'd been told my whole life that what mattered was the other kind. Tamsin came and sat down on the hay bale beside her. You said something to me, Lenora said. Weeks ago. In the yard. You said I could learn the land if I wanted to. I meant it. I know you did. Lenora looked at her hands. I want to. I think I want to. I don't know if I'm good at it. You won't know until you try. Will you? She stopped. Reconsidered. I'm not asking because of the lease or because I need something from you. I'm asking because I watched you last night from the porch when you came home, and you looked like someone who had done something that mattered, and I've never felt that. I'd like to feel it. She looked at Tamsin directly. Will you teach me? Tamsin looked at her half-sister. She'd spent 9 years categorizing Lenora as part of the architecture of this household, part of the system that had kept her in the kitchen and behind the serving table. Which was true and fair, and also not the whole truth, because Lenora was 22 years old and had been given no more choices than Tamsin had, just different ones, and had been handed the same diminished vision of herself that this house had handed to all its women, just in a different shape. Yes, Tamsin said, I'll teach you. Lenora nodded. She looked back at her hands. Something in her posture shifted, very slightly, like a tension that had been held too long beginning to release. He's coming to the harvest dance, isn't he? Lenora said. Whitlock. I don't know, Tamsin said. He will, Lenora said, with a certainty that was almost amused. He's not subtle about it. Anyone with eyes can see it. She paused. Are you going to make him wait forever? I'm going to make him wait the appropriate amount of time, Tamsin said. Which is? I haven't decided yet. Lenora made a small sound that was the first genuinely unperformed thing Tamsin had heard from her. You're a difficult woman, she said. Yes, Tamsin agreed. They sat for a moment in the barn in the afternoon heat, and then Lenora stood and smoothed her dress and said she'd start learning tomorrow if Tamsin would show her the water tank readings. And Tamsin said yes, and she went back to the leather strap. The following week was work. The basin needed assessment after the fire. Every rancher, with sections adjacent to the burn zone, needed to check their fence lines and their water sources and their soil for heat damage. Tamsin's organized it, not because anyone asked her to, but because it needed organizing, and she was the one who knew how to do it. She sent writers to each property with a simple checklist she wrote out by hand, and she coordinated the information as it came back. And she spent 3 mornings writing sections with different ranchers showing them what to look for. She took Lenora on the second morning. She showed her the water tank readings first, which were more complex than they looked, because you had to read 3 different markers and cross-reference them against the season and the recent weather. And Lenora was quiet and focused in a way that Tamsin hadn't expected. She asked good questions. Not sophisticated questions, not yet, but honest ones, the questions of someone who was genuinely trying to understand rather than trying to appear to understand. Your mother taught you all of this, Lenora said on the ride back. Yes, and her mother taught her, probably. She never said directly, but that's how it works. Lenora looked at the basin around them, the burned section visible in the northeast as a black patch against the dry gold, the ridge above it with the firebreak lines clear and pale. It's like a language, she said. Tamsin looked at her. Yes, she said, that's exactly what it is. Lenora nodded slowly. She looked like she was turning something over in her mind and hadn't finished with it yet. Ronan came by on a Thursday, not for a meeting, just came by, the way you came by when you had been making yourself stay away and had run out of reasons to do that. Tamsin was at the fence near the water trough when he arrived, and she didn't stop working because the fence needed working, and she'd found that doing something with her hands made conversations easier. He leaned against the post and watched her for a while without speaking. Sterling is restructuring the basin leases, he said eventually. All of them, not just yours. He's adding a stewardship assessment to the terms. Properties that demonstrate long-term land management practices get better rates and extended terms. She looked at him. That's significant. He said, and I'll quote this, because it's worth quoting, that watching you manage the fire event was the most instructive 4 hours he'd spent in 15 years of estate work. He paused. He said it taught him that he'd been valuing the wrong things. She went back to the fence. He's a fast learner. He is, Ronan agreed. It's one of his better qualities. She worked the wire, and he stood there, and neither of them said anything for a while. And the afternoon moved around them, and the cattle moved in the pasture behind her, and the sky above the basin was the particular deep blue of early September when the heat is breaking. The harvest dance is in 3 weeks, he said. I know. I'd like to attend with you. He said it directly, which was the only way he said things that mattered to him. Not as your escort, exactly. Not in the way where I'm collecting you and presenting you. More like, he paused, more like going to the same place at the same time and not pretending we don't know each other. She looked at him over the fence wire. That's a careful way to ask. I'm trying to ask it the way you need it to be asked, he said. She held the wire in both hands and thought about it. She thought about the last harvest dance she'd attended 2 years ago, when she'd stood at the edge of the lamplight in a faded skirt and refused 3 invitations to dance and watched the room and felt, as she usually felt in those rooms, that she was observing something she was not quite part of. She thought about what it would mean to walk into that room as herself. Not hidden, not the gray dress, not the tight hair and the faded work clothes. Just herself, which was something she hadn't fully permitted in a public space, and so long she wasn't sure she remembered how it felt. I'll think about it, she said. That's more than I had yesterday, he said, and she heard something in his voice that might have been quiet relief. She finished the fence, and he left and she went in for supper and sat at the table with her father and Dorothea and her half-sisters. And Orson talked about the west fence repair, and Blythe talked about the preserves she was putting up, and Lenora was quieter than usual, listening more than talking. And Dorothea asked Tamsin what she thought about the weather pattern coming in from the north and whether it looked like rain. Tamsin said she thought it might, but not enough to solve the water table problem, and they'd need to be managing the spring levels carefully through the fall. Dorothea nodded and said she'd note it for the household planning. It was a small thing. Tamsin answered a question about the land at the family supper table, and everyone received the answer as information rather than interruption. It was, she thought, the kind of small thing was actually not small at all. After supper, she went out and sat on the porch in the dark and looked at the stars and thought about the harvest dance. She thought about what she would wear. She thought about what it meant to stop hiding, not just in front of one person who had seen her anyway, but in front of a room full of people who had a fixed idea of who she was. She thought about Cora Besh at the dry goods store. She thought about the 2 men at the dance. She thought about 26 years of making herself small so that people would find her less threatening, less complicated, less difficult to put in a category. She thought about how well it had worked. It had not worked. The people who wanted to reduce her had done so, regardless of the gray dress and the tight hair and the quiet at the supper table. They'd found their category for her anyway. And the people who hadn't wanted to reduce her, Ronan, Sterling in his precise way, old Dalloway, even Pruett in the end, had seen her regardless. The gray dress had accomplished nothing except making her colder in winter. She sat with this for a while. Then Blythe came out and sat beside her without asking, which was Blythe's way. She was the youngest, and she had a directness that came from being too young to have fully learned to manage it yet. Are you thinking about the dance? Blythe said. Tamsin looked at her. How'd you know? You have the same face you had when you were working out the backfire, Blythe said. Like you're calculating something you haven't finished yet. Tamsin was quiet for a moment. Do I? Yes. Blythe pulled her knees up to her chest and looked at the sky. I think you should go, she said, to the dance. And I think you should wear the green dress. Tamsin raised an eyebrow. I don't own a green dress. No, Blythe said. But Mama does, and she offered it. She told me to tell you. She said she'd let it out at the waist and take it in at the shoulders, because she said you're shaped differently than she is. She glanced at Tamsin sideways. She asked me to tell you because she didn't know how you'd take it if she said it herself. Tamsin looked at her youngest half-sister in the dark. Blythe was 19 and more perceptive than she usually let show, which was a quality that ran in this family in ways that had been systematically underused. "Tell her thank you," Tamsin said. "Does that mean yes?" She looked at the stars. The basin was very quiet around them, the good quiet of a place that had survived something and was now resting in the aftermath of it. "It means thank you," Tamsin said. "I'll decide about the dance separately." Blythe accepted this and leaned her head against the porch post and looked at the sky and didn't push further, which made Tamsin think that of the two younger sisters, Blythe might actually be the easier one to teach. She sat on the porch a while longer after Blythe went in. She thought about what Sterling had said, wasted as a tenant's daughter. She thought about what Ronan had said on the East Line when the fire was running. "Where do you want me?" She thought about Kemper looking at his barn and Dalloway's house, with 31 years behind it, and Pruitt saying all right and cutting the brake that held the anchor. She thought about a horse tangled in its tether at the Morrow barn, and a man who held a lantern at the right height without being asked. She thought about what she wanted, not what was practical, or what was careful, or what would protect her from the particular kinds of harm that had always been most available to women in this valley. What she actually wanted. It took her a while to locate it clearly, because she'd spent so long thinking around it rather than at it. But it was there, under the careful management, under the gray dress and the tight hair and the 14 years of documentation that she'd kept for herself, because there was no one else to keep it for. Under all of that, the actual thing. She wanted to be seen. Fully, without having to make herself invisible first. She wanted to do the work she knew how to do and have it mean something in the world rather than just in her own head. She wanted the door she'd been standing in front of for weeks to open, and she wanted to walk through it on her own terms, not because someone had pushed her or because the alternative had gotten worse than the risk. She went inside. She knocked on Dorothea's door. Dorothea answered in her nightclothes, looking surprised in a way she was too composed to show fully. And Tamsin said, "Tell me about the green dress. What you'd need to do to it." Dorothea looked at her for a moment. Something moved across her face that was not quite the practical expression she usually wore. Something softer and more complicated. "Come in," she said. "I'll show you." She went in. Dorothea brought the dress out of the wardrobe and held it up in the lamplight, and it was a deep, rich green, the color of the basin grass in a good spring. And it had a cut that was simple and good, and nothing like the gray dress in any possible respect. Tamsin looked at it. "The shoulders are the main thing," Dorothea said in her practical voice. "And the waist slightly. It won't take more than an evening." "I'll need it by the harvest dance," Tamsin said. Dorothea nodded. She was already turning the dress to look at the seams. "Dorothea," Tamsin said. She looked up. "Thank you," Tamsin said. She meant it entirely, without reservation, which was not the most comfortable feeling, but felt necessary. Dorothea held her eyes for a moment. "You are very much like your mother," she said for the second time. And this time Tamsin understood clearly that it was a compliment, and that it had always been a compliment. And that saying it had cost Dorothea something she hadn't been able to afford until now. She went back to her room. She lay in the dark and thought about the harvests 3 weeks away, and about the green dress, and about a man who was patient in a way that had stopped being a problem and started being something else entirely. She thought about ready and willing and the difference between them. She closed her eyes. Outside, the first rain of the season began very quietly to fall. The rain that started that night lasted 3 days. Not enough to solve the water table, as she'd told Dorothea it wouldn't be, but enough to settle the burned sections and bring a thin green edge back to the lower pasture grass and make the air smell like something other than smoke and dry heat. She checked the spring levels on the second morning of the rain and found them up half an inch, which was small but real, and she wrote it in the water records with her mother's pen that she'd kept in the kitchen drawer for 12 years. She noted the date. She noted the measurement. She noted that the rain had come from the northwest, which was the direction good rain came from in this basin. She closed the record book and went to start the day. The harvest dance was on a Saturday in late September, and the 3 weeks between Sterling's visit and that Saturday were the busiest of her year. The post-fire assessment work, the fall cattle rotation, the fence repairs that couldn't wait, and alongside all of it, the new thing Lenora, riding with her 3 mornings a week, learning to read the water markers and the grass and the wind. Lenora was not a natural the way Tamsin's mother had been a natural, the way Tamsin herself was, but she was steady, and she was honest about what she didn't understand, which was more than most people managed. On the second week, Lenora found the low spot in the north pasture fence that Tamsin had missed. She pointed it out without drama, just said, "That post looks wrong to me," and it was wrong, leaning at the angle that meant the ground beneath it had shifted, probably from the heat of the fire passing close. "Good eye," Tamsin said. Lenora looked like she didn't quite know what to do with that. Then she said, "I'll remember to check the posts near the burn line," and she wrote it in the small notebook she'd started carrying, which was something Tamsin hadn't suggested, and which meant Lenora had arrived at it herself. That mattered more than finding the post. The dance came. Dorothea had finished the green dress the week before, and it fit in the way that well-altered clothing fits not perfectly, because nothing fits perfectly on a real body, but honestly, shaped to what was actually there, rather than to an ideal of what should be. Tamsin stood in front of the washstand mirror the evening of the dance, and looked at herself for a longer time than she usually allowed. She looked like herself, not the gray dress version. Not the faded, patched, deliberately invisible version. The actual version, the one that had been underneath all of it, the whole time, waiting without particular urgency for the occasion to be worth it. She let her hair down. She had not worn her hair loose in public since she was 14 years old. It fell past her shoulders, the color of late summer grass in good light, and she looked at it in the mirror and thought about all the years of tying it back, and what that had been about, and whether it had served any of the purposes she'd assigned it. It hadn't. She knew that now. The people she'd been trying to disappear from had seen her anyway, and the people worth being seen by had seen her regardless of the hair. She went downstairs. Orson was in the front room, dressed for the dance himself, and he looked up when she came down the stairs and went very still for a moment. Something crossed his face recognition, she thought, of a kind that went deeper than just seeing his daughter in a good dress. He saw the woman she'd become, fully, maybe for the first time, without the interference of all the roles he'd assigned her. "You look like her," he said. His voice was not entirely steady. She knew who he meant. She'd known it, the first time he'd said something like this, years ago, when she'd caught him watching her work the cattle from the fence rail, with an expression she hadn't understood then. "I know," she said. She wasn't going to make it easier for him than that. But she wasn't going to make it harder either. He nodded. He offered her his arm to walk to the wagon, which he hadn't done since she was small, and she took it because some gestures don't require full resolution of everything behind them to be worth accepting. The Morrow barn was full. The same barn where the gray gelding had tangled in its tether, where she'd knelt in the dirt with her knife and her mother's calming sound, where a man had held a lantern at the right height and watched her hands. The lanterns were lit and the fiddle was already going, and the room had the particular warm density of a community that had been through something together and was now celebrating the fact of having come through it. She felt the room change when she walked in. Not dramatically, not the way rooms changed in stories, with everything stopping. More like a subtle shift in attention, a turning, people noticing, and then their expression changing slightly as they registered who it was and found that their category for her didn't quite fit anymore. Cora Besh was near the refreshment table. She looked at Tamsin and said nothing. Tamsin looked back at her for exactly 1 second and then moved on, because there was nothing useful in that direction, and she had better things to do with her attention. Dalloway found her near the door and shook her hand, actually shook it. The firm, complete handshake of someone greeting an equal, and said the rain had done good things to the creek level on his eastern section. Pruitt came over and talked for 10 minutes about the fall grazing plan and whether the burn section would be safe to open to limited grazing by spring, and she told him probably yes if the rain held through October. And he listened and nodded and treated the information as information. Kemper was there. She hadn't expected him. She'd thought the barn loss might keep him away, that it would be too soon. But he was there with his wife, and when he saw Tamsin, he crossed the room and said, "We broke ground on the new barn yesterday," and she could hear in his voice the particular kind of determination that comes from loss. The kind that isn't hope exactly, but something more durable than hope. "Good," she said. "I'll come help when you're ready to raise it." He looked at her. "You don't have to do that." "I know," she said. "I'll come anyway. He nodded once, and that was enough. Ronan arrived 30 minutes after she did, which she noticed without appearing to notice, and he came through the door in a clean jacket, a different one from the ruined one, which she'd been mildly curious about, and he looked across the room and found her immediately, which also did not surprise her. They'd been finding each other in rooms for months now. It had become a kind of reflex. He came over without hurry, the way he did everything. "You're here," he said. "I said I'd think about it," she said. "I thought about it." His eyes moved over her, not the way men's eyes usually moved over her, assessing or claiming, but something quieter. Something that said, "I see you," and meant it past the surface. "The green," he said. "Dorothea's," she said, altered. "It's good," he said simply. They stood together at the edge of the dance floor and watched the room for a while, and then Ronan said, "I have a question." "Ask it. Are you going to make me wait until spring?" She turned to look at him. He was looking at her directly, with the patience that was his most consistent quality, but underneath it, something less patient. Something that had been waiting a long time and knew it and was asking her to know it too. She thought about ready and willing. She thought about a door. "No," she said. "I'm not going to make you wait until spring." Something in his face changed, just slightly. The particular change of a man who has been holding something carefully for a long time and has just been told he can set it down. "Then I'd like to ask you something," he said. "You'd like to ask me to dance," she said. "Eventually," he said. "First, I'd like to ask you to marry me." The fiddle went on playing. The room went on being the room, warm and full, and smelling of sawdust and lamp oil, and the good noise of people who had survived a difficult season together. She stood in the middle of all of it in the green dress, with her hair loose, and she looked at the man in front of her, who had held a lantern at the right height, and asked, "Where do you want me?" and ordered fire breaks cut based on her reading of the wind. "I'll marry you," she said, "but I need you to understand something first." "Tell me." "I won't become the woman who married the man who owns the valley," she said. "I'll be the woman who runs the eastern sections and manages the water allocation and trains the ranchers' daughters to read the land, and I'll also be your wife. Those things are the same woman. You don't get to decide which parts are visible." "I know that," he said. "You think you know it now. I need you to know it when it's inconvenient, when Sterling thinks I've overstepped, when Pruitt disagrees with my assessment and wants to take it to you instead, when people in this town decide they have opinions about how a woman in my position should conduct herself." "I know it then too," he said. He said it without flinching, which was what she'd needed to see. She looked at him. "All right," she said. "Yes." He didn't make a production of it. He didn't sweep her into anything or make a speech. He took her hand and held it, and they stood like that for a moment, and then the fiddle shifted into something slower, and he asked if she wanted to dance, and she said yes, and they moved onto the floor. She danced, properly, fully, not at the edge of the lamplight, but in the middle of the room, and people watched, and she let them watch, and it did not cost her anything she wasn't willing to spend. This is what she understood, later, not that night, but in the weeks and months and years that followed. She understood it the way you understand things that are too large to see all at once, gradually, in pieces, until one day you have the whole shape of it. She understood that hiding had never been a protection. It had been a tax she paid to make other people comfortable with their assumptions about her, and it had cost her years of herself that she couldn't recover. The gray dress hadn't made her safer. It had just made her harder to see, and the people who wanted to reduce her had reduced her anyway, and the people worth knowing had waited patiently for her to stop paying the tax. She understood that the women in this valley, who came after her, Lenora, Blythe, and eventually the daughters of ranchers who would ride with her in the years ahead, were going to inherit a different set of assumptions than she had. Not perfect assumptions. Nothing was ever perfect. But different ones, shifted slightly by what she had demonstrated, was possible when a woman was permitted or permitted herself to be competent in full view. That was not a small thing. She understood that too. She and Ronan married before the first snow, in a small ceremony with the family and a few neighbors, and in the spring she began directing the Red Willow Basin land operations formally, with her name on the documents and her decisions standing without requiring his signature to carry weight. Sterling restructured the basin leases, and the Alderidge lease was among the first rewritten under the new stewardship terms. Orson never fully found the words for what he owed her. She stopped waiting for them. She understood by then that some debts get paid in other currencies, in the way he had deferred to her judgment at meetings, in the way he told the story of the fire to anyone who asked, in the way he sometimes stood at the kitchen door, watching her work with an expression she'd finally learned to read correctly. It was not complicated. It was a father who had failed to see his daughter, and was now, too late and imperfectly, trying to see her. She let him try. The old gray dress remained hanging beside the kitchen door, in the house she and Ronan built on the eastern ridge, where she could see the whole basin from the front window. It hung there not because she needed it anymore. She had never needed it, she understood now. It had never done the work she'd assigned it, but because it reminded her of who she had been when she thought invisible was the safest thing to be. And every time she walked past it on her way out the door to do the work she was built to do, in whatever she chose to wear. With her hair, however, she chose to wear it. She thought about a frightened horse and a man with a lantern, and the specific moment when being fully seen had stopped feeling like a danger. It had taken 26 years to get there. It was worth every one of them to arrive.